Arizona Territory, 1885. The copper sun sank behind the Dragoon Mountains, painting the desert in streaks of gold and crimson. Isaac Young wiped his brow with a dusty bandana, his eyes fixed on the sprawling acres of untamed land before him. At 26, his shoulders already carried the weight of a man twice his age, muscles hardened from years of breaking horses and driving cattle. Yet for all his physical strength, a hollow ache persisted inside him, one that no amount of frontier grit could fill. "Nobody builds anything to last out here," he muttered to his horse, a chestnut stallion that had been his only faithful companion for 3 years. "The desert takes it all back eventually." Isaac had learned this truth when Comanche raiders swept through his family's Texas homestead when he was just 14. By 16, he was riding with cattle outfits, and by 20, he'd saved enough to buy this patch of Arizona Territory, 200 acres of promise and dust. But the dream of turning it into something meaningful felt increasingly hollow as the months of solitude stretched into years. The land was beautiful in its harsh way. Saguaros standing sentinel across rolling scrubland, a year-round creek cutting through the northern boundary, and enough grazing land to support a modest herd. But what good was building something with no one to share it with? No one to pass it on to? "Men like us die alone, Phoenix," he told his horse, patting its muscled neck. "That's just the way of things out here." The town of Copper Springs lay 5 miles east, little more than a general store, saloon, church, and scattered homesteads. Isaac avoided it when possible, riding in only for supplies or to sell his modest crop of vegetables grown in the creek-fed garden plot. He'd built his cabin with his own hands, simple but sturdy, and each night he'd sit on the porch and watch the stars wheel overhead, feeling smaller and more alone than the day before. Some nights, particularly when spring flowers dotted the desert floor, unwelcome thoughts would creep in, wondering what it might be like to hear laughter in his home, to build something that mattered beyond mere survival. But such thoughts were dangerous out here. Love was a luxury reserved for settled lands, not the savage beauty of the Arizona frontier. "The moment you start wanting more is when you lose what little you have," he reminded himself, the mantra worn smooth from repetition. A man survived by keeping his head down and his expectations lower. Those who reached for more invariably found their dreams turn to dust in their hands. As Isaac turned Phoenix toward home, he had no way of knowing that tomorrow would be the day everything changed. The spring wagon lurched violently as its wheel dropped into yet another rut. Grace Nolan clutched the bench seat with white knuckles, her 20-year-old frame tense with exhaustion. Her honey-blonde hair had long since escaped its pins, and her blue calico dress bore the dust of 10 days' hard travel from Tucson. "Just a few more miles, Miss Nolan," called Mr. Winters from the driver's seat. The elderly storekeeper had been kind enough to transport her from the stage stop in Tucson to her new position in Copper Springs. "Town's not much, but they're decent folk." Grace nodded, too tired for conversation. Behind her in the wagon bed, 5 children slumbered in various uncomfortable positions, their small bodies swaying with the wagon's motion. 3 boys and 2 girls, aged 4 to 9, orphaned by the typhoid outbreak that had claimed their parents and dozens of others in the mining town of Globe. The Children's Welfare Society in Tucson had been overwhelmed. When Grace, a teacher's assistant at the time, volunteered to accompany these 5 to Copper Springs where the church had offered temporary shelter, she'd imagined a brief journey before returning to her position. But the society's director had other ideas. "We need someone to stay with them, Miss Nolan, just until we can place them with families," the director had explained. "The church has a small building, and the town has agreed to provide a stipend. It might be a month or 2 at most." That was how Grace found herself bouncing along a rutted desert road, her few possessions packed alongside 5 traumatized children, heading to a town she'd never seen to undertake a task for which she felt woefully unprepared. "There it is," Mr. Winters announced, pointing toward a cluster of buildings that had appeared on the horizon. "Copper Springs." Grace squinted against the setting sun. The town seemed impossibly small, hardly more than a wide spot in the road. Her heart sank. How would she manage here? How would she give these children what they needed? The wagon rolled to a stop outside a whitewashed building with a modest cross mounted above its door. A gray-haired woman emerged, followed by several townsfolk who had evidently been awaiting their arrival. "You must be Miss Nolan," the woman said, approaching with hands outstretched. "I'm Martha Blackwell, the minister's wife. We've prepared the old schoolhouse for you and the little ones." As the children were gently roused and introduced to their new caretakers, Grace noticed curious stares from the gathered crowd. She straightened her spine, determined to appear more confident than she felt. The old schoolhouse proved to be a single room with a small lean-to kitchen attached. 6 narrow cots had been arranged, 5 for the children and 1 for her. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner and a scarred desk another. The walls were bare except for a faded map of the United States. "It's not much," Martha apologized, "but it's clean. The town's taken up a collection for food and necessities." Grace nodded gratefully, though her mind was racing with all they would need. A proper school setup, books, clothes for growing children, a garden perhaps. "How long will the church support us?" she asked quietly while the children explored their new quarters. Martha's expression grew troubled. "The collection will last a month, maybe 2. After that," she shrugged helplessly. "The town's not wealthy, Miss Nolan. Most folks are just getting by themselves." That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, Grace sat at the desk by lamplight, making lists and calculations that refused to balance. The funds would run out long before any permanent arrangements could be made for the children. Without families willing to adopt them, their future looked bleak indeed. Outside, a spring thunderstorm rolled across the desert. As rain lashed against the windows, Grace found herself questioning every decision that had led her here. She'd always believed that good intentions and hard work could overcome any obstacle, but the harsh realities of frontier life were quickly eroding that conviction. "This is impossible," she whispered, staring at her inadequate figures. "I can't do this alone." Little did she know that 10 miles away, a solitary cowboy was making his way home through the same storm, equally convinced that some burdens were never meant to be shared. 3 days later, Isaac rode into Copper Springs for supplies, Phoenix's hooves kicking up dust along the single street. He nodded curtly to familiar faces, but didn't slow for conversation. The sooner he could load up and head back to his ranch, the better. Approaching the general store, he noticed unusual activity around the old schoolhouse, a building that had stood empty since the previous teacher had departed 2 winters ago. Children's voices carried on the breeze, something so unexpected that Isaac actually pulled Phoenix to a halt. 5 children of various sizes were engaged in what appeared to be a chaotic attempt at gardening. A young woman moved among them, demonstrating how to dig proper furrows in the hard-packed earth. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a practical bun, though several strands had escaped to frame her face. Her blue dress, while modest, couldn't hide the graceful way she moved. Isaac was so distracted by the scene that he didn't notice old Jim Winters approaching until the man spoke. "Orphans from Globe," Jim explained, following Isaac's gaze. "Typhoid took their folks. That's Miss Grace Nolan looking after them. Church is sponsoring them, but word is the money won't last long." Isaac frowned. "Seems a foolish arrangement. This town can barely support its own." "Maybe so," Jim conceded, "but what else could be done? Can't just leave children to fend for themselves, even out here." Before Isaac could respond, one of the boys, no more than 7 years old, spotted them and came running over, his face alight with excitement. "Are you a real cowboy?" the boy asked, staring up at Isaac with undisguised awe. Isaac shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I suppose I am. Do you shoot outlaws and rope steers and everything?" "Timothy." The young woman had noticed her charge's absence and hurried over, cheeks flushed from exertion and embarrassment. "Don't bother the gentleman." Up close, Grace Nolan was even more striking. Her eyes were a clear blue that reminded Isaac of summer skies, and despite the frontier conditions, there was a determination in her expression that suggested uncommon strength. "He's not bothering me, ma'am," Isaac said, surprising himself with the response. He tipped his hat. "Isaac Young. I have a small spread north of town." "Grace Nolan," she replied with a brief curtsy. "I apologize for Timothy's enthusiasm. The children have been reading penny dreadfuls, and I'm afraid they have rather romantic notions about Western life." Her voice carried a slight Eastern accent, softened but still detectable. Isaac guessed she hadn't been in the territory long. No harm done. He found himself reluctant to end the conversation, an unusual sensation. "You're planting awfully late for a garden." Grace's expression faltered slightly. "We're experimenting." The children need something constructive to do, and we need to supplement our provisions. You're wasting your time with that soil, Isaac said bluntly, then immediately regretted his tone when her face fell. What I mean is, you need better earth and proper irrigation to grow anything substantial here. She lifted her chin. We're making do with what we have, Mr. Young. Something about her quiet dignity in the face of what was clearly a desperate situation stirred something in Isaac, an uncomfortable feeling he quickly tried to suppress. Well, good luck to you, Miss Nolan. He tipped his hat again and urged Phoenix forward, eager to escape the unexpected encounter. As he loaded supplies into his saddlebags, Isaac couldn't shake the image of those children attempting to coax life from barren ground, nor of the young woman brave enough to try against all odds. It was none of his concern, he told himself firmly. Their chances of success were slim to none, and attachment to such a doomed enterprise would only end in heartache. Yet as he rode home, the silence of his ranch felt heavier than it had that morning. A week later, Grace stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse, watching rain pour from the roof in steady streams. The storm had begun suddenly, sending the children scurrying inside from their play. Now thunder rolled across the sky, and lightning illuminated the growing puddles in what remained of their garden attempt. Their meager seedlings, struggling valiantly against poor soil and harsh conditions, would surely be washed away by morning. Grace pressed her lips together, fighting back tears of frustration. Every setback chipped away at her dwindling reserves of optimism. The door to the general store across the street burst open, and a figure emerged, hunched against the downpour. Grace squinted through the rain, recognizing the tall, broad-shouldered silhouette of Isaac Young. He hadn't returned to town since their brief encounter, though she'd found herself thinking of him more often than she cared to admit. There was something in his green eyes, a loneliness that matched her own, perhaps, that had stayed with her. She'd made discreet inquiries about him and learned he kept mostly to himself on a promising piece of land with year-round water. Capable but closed off, Martha had described him, since losing his family years back. Now, instead of mounting his horse, Isaac was striding purposefully toward the schoolhouse. Grace hurriedly smoothed her skirt and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Miss Nolan, he called as he approached, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. I was in town and thought to check. He stopped short, noticing her expression. Is something wrong? Grace gestured helplessly toward their ruined garden. Just watching a week's work wash away, she said, attempting a light tone but failing. The children will be devastated. Isaac studied the sodden plot of earth, then glanced at the building behind her. Through the window, 5 small faces were pressed against the glass, watching them. May I come in? He asked, surprising her. Out of this rain. Grace stepped aside, and Isaac removed his hat as he entered, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly when damp. The children immediately surrounded him, peppering him with questions about his horse, his guns, and whether he'd ever been in a real gunfight. That's enough, Grace chided gently. Mr. Young isn't here for an interrogation. Actually, Isaac said, I came to make a proposition. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he handed to Grace. It was a crude but effective drawing of a garden layout, complete with irrigation channels. Your soil here isn't suitable for what you're trying to grow, he explained. But I have good bottomland near my creek that's going unused. I thought perhaps. He trailed off, seeming suddenly uncertain. Grace studied the drawing, hardly daring to hope. You're offering us garden space on your ranch? She asked. Isaac nodded, his expression guarded. It's a fair ride from town, but the soil's rich. With proper care, it could yield enough to see you through winter and beyond. That's incredibly generous, Mr. Young, but I'm not sure how we would manage the distance. I could bring a wagon on Saturdays, he offered, the words coming quickly as if he feared he might reconsider. For you and the children to tend it. My time is my own, and the land's just sitting there. Grace studied him, trying to understand what had prompted this offer from a man known for keeping to himself. May I ask why you do this for us? Isaac shifted uncomfortably, his gaze moving to the children who watched with undisguised fascination. No one should go hungry when there's good earth lying fallow, he said simply. Something in his tone told Grace there was more to it than that, but she didn't press. Instead, she extended her hand. We accept with gratitude, Mr. Young. His calloused hand enveloped hers briefly, and Grace felt an unexpected warmth spread through her at the contact. For the first time since arriving in Copper Springs, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. Saturday, then, Isaac said, retrieving his hat. 8 o'clock. As promised, Isaac arrived at dawn that Saturday with a wagon hitched to a sturdy team. The children scrambled aboard with excited chatter, while Grace followed more sedately, conscious of Isaac's watchful gaze. The journey to his ranch revealed a different Arizona than Grace had yet encountered. Beyond the town's dusty confines, the desert bloomed with unexpected beauty. Ocotillo crowned with crimson flowers, prickly pear bearing yellow blooms, and in shaded arroyos, wildflowers carpeted the ground. "It's beautiful," Grace murmured, more to herself than to Isaac. He glanced at her, surprise evident in his expression. Most Easterners see only the harshness. "Oh, it's harsh," she agreed, "but magnificent in its way. Like it demands you earn its beauty by enduring its challenges." Something shifted in Isaac's face, a softening around his eyes. "That's an interesting way to look at it." They crested a small rise, and suddenly his ranch spread before them. A modest cabin with a corral and barn nestled against red rock formations. A creek glittered in the morning sun, its banks lined with cottonwoods. In the distance, a small herd of cattle grazed on surprisingly lush grass. "You've built something wonderful here," Grace said sincerely. Isaac's hands tightened on the reins. "It's just a beginning," he replied, an edge of defensiveness in his tone. "Nowhere near what it could be." The children's excitement upon reaching the ranch was boundless. They explored every corner, from the barn where two horses watched them curiously to the creek where tiny fish darted in the shallows. Isaac showed them the plot he'd marked for their garden, a half-acre of dark soil near the creek, already plowed and ready for planting. "The water flows year-round," he explained as he demonstrated the simple irrigation system he'd devised. "Even in the dry months, this land stays fertile." Grace watched as he patiently answered the children's endless questions, showing a gentleness she hadn't expected from his stern exterior. Timothy in particular followed Isaac like a shadow, hanging on his every word about ranching and horses. By midday, they had planted rows of beans, corn, squash, and tomatoes. Isaac provided seedlings he'd started weeks earlier, explaining he'd intended them for his own garden but had more than he needed. Grace suspected this wasn't entirely true but thanked him nonetheless. They ate a simple picnic lunch beneath a cottonwood, the children chattering about all they would grow. For the first time since arriving in Arizona, Grace saw genuine happiness on their faces, not just the brave fronts they'd maintained since losing their parents. As the afternoon waned, Isaac gave them a tour of the rest of his property. The cabin was simple but solid, with a stone fireplace and handcrafted furniture. He seemed almost embarrassed by its sparseness, apologizing for the lack of civilized comforts. "It's a true home," Grace assured him. "That's worth more than fancy trappings." Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them, recognition, perhaps, of similar values despite their different paths. The ride back to town was quieter, the children tired from their day of work and excitement. 9-year-old Emma fell asleep against Grace's shoulder, while the younger ones dozed in the back of the wagon. Timothy, however, remained alert, peppering Isaac with questions about ranching. "Could I learn to ride someday, Mr. Young?" the boy asked, his expression earnest. Isaac hesitated, glancing at Grace as if seeking permission. "If Miss Nolan approves, I could teach you basics. Every ranch hand needs to start somewhere." "Oh, please, Miss Grace," Timothy pleaded. "I want to be a rancher someday." Grace smiled, touched by Isaac's offer. "We'll see. Mr. Young is very busy with his own work." "It's no trouble," Isaac said quietly. "The boy should learn useful skills." As they reached the outskirts of Copper Springs, the setting sun painted the desert in gold and shadow. Isaac pulled the wagon to a halt, seeming reluctant to enter town. "Same time next Saturday?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grace nodded, equally careful to hide the eagerness she felt at the prospect. "We'll be ready. And thank you again, Mr. Young. Your kindness means more than you know." A faint color touched his tanned cheeks. "Isaac," he said abruptly. "You might as well call me Isaac, if we're to be gardening partners." "Isaac," she repeated, liking the way it felt. "And I'm Grace." His smile, rare and transformative, stayed with her long after he'd deposited them at the schoolhouse and disappeared into the gathering dusk. The weekly trips to Isaac's ranch quickly became the highlight of their existence. Each Saturday brought new discoveries, watching seeds sprout into seedlings, learning to gentle a skittish colt, identifying the tracks of desert animals. The children blossomed under Isaac's gruff but patient tutelage, especially Timothy, who followed him everywhere. For Isaac, the intrusion of Grace and the orphans into his solitary life had been jarring at first. After years of silence broken only by the sounds of nature and his own voice, the cabin echoed with children's laughter and endless questions. He found himself working late into the night during the week, preparing projects and lessons for their visits. "You're changing that place," Jim Winters remarked one day when Isaac came to town for supplies. "Never seen you buy so much sugar and flour before. Making cookies now, are you?" Isaac scowled, though there was no real heat behind it. "The children need proper nourishment to work. Nothing more to it." Jim just smiled knowingly and added a paper of peppermint sticks to Isaac's order. "On the house," he said with a wink. The truth, which Isaac barely admitted even to himself, was that the empty spaces in his life were filling with something dangerously like hope. Each Saturday, he rose before dawn to ensure everything was perfect for their arrival. He found himself noting things throughout the week that he wanted to show Grace: a hummingbird nest, a particularly fine sunset, the first ripe berries along the creek. Grace, too, found herself counting days between visits. The ranch had become a respite from the increasingly precarious situation in town. The church's funds were dwindling faster than expected, and while the garden at Isaac's ranch promised future sustenance, it couldn't address their immediate needs for clothing, school supplies, and medicine. One sweltering August Saturday, Grace arrived at the ranch looking particularly drawn. The children raced to the garden as usual, eager to see how much their plants had grown, but Grace lingered by the wagon. "Is something wrong?" Isaac asked, noticing the worry lines around her eyes. She hesitated, clearly reluctant to burden him with her problems. "It's nothing you need concern yourself with." "Grace," he said firmly, "tell me." The simple directness of his concern broke through her reserve. "The church fund is nearly depleted," she admitted. "Reverend Blackwell says they can maintain the schoolhouse for us, but there will be no more monthly stipend. I've been taking in sewing and laundry, but it's barely enough for food." Isaac frowned, his mind already calculating. "The garden will produce soon. That will help." "Yes, but winter will come eventually. And the children are growing so fast. They need new clothes, boots." She shook her head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with this." "It's not a burden," Isaac said, surprised to realize he meant it. "We'll figure something out." The we slipped out unbidden, and they both noticed it. Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement that whatever this arrangement was, it had become more than charity or convenience. That evening, after a day of tending the flourishing garden and fishing in the creek, Isaac suggested the children stay for supper. He'd prepared a stew with vegetables and rabbit, and Grace watched with quiet pleasure as he served each child with careful attention to their preferences. As dusk approached, Emma spotted a shooting star through the cabin window. Soon they were all outside, spread on blankets in the yard, watching the meteor shower that streaked across the desert sky. The children exclaimed with each fiery trail, making wishes and pointing out patterns. Isaac found himself beside Grace, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Above them, the Milky Way spilled across the darkness like scattered diamonds. "I never tire of this view," Grace murmured. In Tucson, the city lights dimmed the stars. But here, she gestured to the magnificent canopy above. "It's one of the reasons I chose this land," Isaac admitted. "Some nights, when I couldn't sleep, I'd come out and just watch them for hours." "What kept you from sleeping?" she asked softly. Isaac was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Memories. Regrets. The usual ghosts that haunt men out here." Grace turned to face him, her profile silvered by starlight. "We all have ghosts, Isaac. Some more deserved than others." He paused, then asked, "What brought you to Arizona, Grace? A woman with your education could have found better prospects elsewhere." She smiled faintly. "My father was a doctor in Philadelphia. He believed in helping those with the greatest need, not those who could pay the most. After he died of influenza last year, I found myself adrift. When the opportunity came to teach in Tucson, it seemed like a way to honor his memory. And now you're saddled with 5 orphans in a town that can barely support you. I prefer to think of it as being entrusted with 5 remarkable children who deserve a chance at happiness. She looked toward where the children lay, some already dozing on the blankets. They've lost everything, yet they still find joy in shooting stars and growing vegetables. How could I possibly complain about my lot when they show such courage? Isaac studied her face, struck by the quiet strength he saw there. You're an unusual woman, Grace Nolan. She laughed softly. Is that a compliment or an observation, Mr. Young? Both, I think. He hesitated, then added, I'm glad you came to Copper Springs. The simple admission cost him more than facing down a band of rustlers, but the smile it brought to Grace's face made his vulnerability worthwhile. Later, as they loaded the sleepy children into the wagon for the journey back to town, Isaac made a decision. I've been thinking, he said as he helped Grace onto the seat. The garden will start producing more than you can use soon. We could sell the excess in town. That's very generous. And, he continued, I've been meaning to expand my cattle operation. I could use help with the new calves coming this fall. Fair wages for fair work. Grace gave him a shrewd look. Are you offering charity, Isaac? I'm offering a business arrangement, he corrected firmly. The boys are old enough to learn, and you have a head for figures I've seen. It would benefit us both. She considered this, clearly weighing her pride against necessity. A true partnership then, with proper accounting and division of profits? Nothing less. Grace extended her hand, and Isaac took it, sealing their agreement with a handshake that lingered perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. Partners, she agreed. As he watched the wagon disappear toward town, Isaac felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The ranch that had been simply a place to exist was becoming something more, something with a future. It both terrified and exhilarated him. Autumn brought change to the high desert, and to the unlikely partnership blooming between the solitary rancher and the determined young teacher. The garden yielded a bountiful harvest, far more than Grace and the children could use. True to his word, Isaac helped them sell the excess in town, setting up a small stand on Saturdays where the children proudly displayed their produce. The proceeds, while modest, provided for immediate necessities. But more importantly, the visible success of their enterprise earned them respect in the community. Families who had been standoffish began inviting Grace and the children to Sunday dinners or offering hand-me-down clothing and books. Timothy and 9-year-old Emma proved especially adept at ranch work. Isaac taught them to feed livestock, mend fences, and even ride gentle mounts. 8-year-old James showed a talent for carpentry, helping Isaac build new shelves for the cabin and repair the barn door. The younger children, 6-year-old Sarah and 4-year-old Daniel, became expert egg collectors, checking the hen house with solemn responsibility. As fall deepened, their visits extended to Wednesdays as well as Saturdays. Isaac would arrive in town after breakfast, collect whoever could be spared from lessons, and put them to work on the ranch while Grace taught the others. By November, it seemed the most natural thing in the world for all of them to spend entire weekends at the ranch, with the children bedding down in the main room while Grace took Isaac's bed and he slept in the barn. For Isaac, these changes represented a profound shift in his worldview. The man who had once believed that attachment only led to loss found himself looking forward to the sound of children's voices and the light Grace brought into his home. His cabin, once Spartan and utilitarian, gradually accumulated evidence of their presence. A child's drawing pinned to the wall, a bouquet of dried wildflowers on the table, the smell of fresh bread from Grace's baking. One crisp November evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after the children had fallen asleep, Isaac found himself telling Grace about his family's ranch in Texas and the Comanche raid that had taken everything from him. He spoke of his years of drifting afterward, the cattle drives and odd jobs, the drinking and fighting that had almost consumed him before he found this land and a reason to start again. I convinced myself that being alone was safer, he admitted, staring into the gathering dusk. That if I didn't care about anyone, I couldn't be hurt when they were gone. Grace's hand found his in the darkness, her touch warm and reassuring. And now, he turned to her, his expression vulnerable in the fading light. Now I'm not so sure that's a price worth paying. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Isaac found himself leaning toward her, drawn by a force as inexorable as gravity. But before their lips could meet, a cry from inside the cabin broke the spell, Daniel waking from a nightmare. Grace withdrew her hand reluctantly. I should go to him. Isaac nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the interruption. Of course. As she disappeared into the cabin, Isaac remained on the porch, his thoughts in turmoil. The walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to rebuild them. December brought the first real challenge to their arrangement. A letter arrived from the Orphan Welfare Society in Tucson, announcing that they had found potential homes for 3 of the children, James, Sarah, and Daniel, with families in Phoenix. They would be separated, Grace said, her voice breaking as she shared the news with Isaac. They stood in the barn, out of earshot of the children who were decorating the cabin for Christmas. James and Sarah together with one family, Daniel with another. And so far from here. Isaac leaned heavily against the stall door, trying to mask his own dismay. Perhaps it's for the best. They'd have proper families, stability. They have stability now, Grace argued. They have us, and each other, and this place they've come to love. She gestured toward the ranch that had become a sanctuary for all of them. They're healing here, Isaac. You've seen it yourself. He had. The haunted looks that had shadowed their eyes when he first met them had gradually been replaced by laughter and confidence. Even little Daniel, who had barely spoken when they arrived, now chattered constantly about the animals and plants he encountered. What alternatives do we have? Isaac asked practically. The society has legal authority. If they found families willing to adopt. Grace paced the length of the barn, agitated. I was appointed their guardian until permanent arrangements could be made. If I could show that they already have a permanent arrangement. She stopped suddenly, turning to face him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Isaac, what if we gave them a home? A real one right here. He stared at her, uncomprehending. The ranch? But it's barely suitable for one man, let alone 5 children, and… He broke off, suddenly understanding what she was suggesting. Grace, are you proposing that we… She approached him, her blue eyes earnest. I know it's unconventional, perhaps even improper to suggest it, but think about it. The children love it here. They're learning valuable skills, growing strong and confident. We work well together, you and I. And I think, she hesitated, then pressed on. I think we've come to care for each other. Isaac felt as if the ground beneath his feet had shifted. He'd been fighting his growing feelings for Grace for months, convinced that acting on them would somehow jinx the fragile happiness they'd built. Marriage, he managed, the word coming out rougher than he'd intended. A partnership, Grace clarified, though her cheeks flushed at his bluntness. In every sense. The children would have a stable home, and the ranch would have the family you've said it needs to truly thrive. It was true. He had told her once that a ranch wasn't meant for a solitary man, that it needed generations to reach its potential. But the leap from theoretical musings to an actual proposal was momentous. This isn't how I imagined. He began. Nor I, Grace admitted, looking down. Forgive me if I've overstepped or presumed. No. Isaac stepped forward, taking her hands in his. That's not what I meant. I just always thought if I ever asked a woman to share my life, there would be romance involved, not simply practical considerations. A smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Are there only practical considerations, Isaac? The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. You know there aren't, he said quietly. I've been falling in love with you since the day you told me Arizona demands we earn its beauty. But you deserve more than a scarred man with a half-built dream. And if that's exactly what I want. Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. A man who understands both hardship and hope, and a dream we can build together? Isaac raised one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. Then I would say you're as crazy as I am, he murmured, and that I would be the luckiest man in the territory. This time when he leaned toward her, there were no interruptions. Their kiss was tentative at first, then bloomed into something that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Is that a yes? Grace asked, her smile radiant despite her tears. Isaac nodded, unable to speak past the emotion constricting his throat. Instead, he drew her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. as if she had been made to fill the empty spaces in his life. They were still standing thus when Timothy burst into the barn, then skidded to a halt at the sight before him. "Are you getting married?" he demanded with a child's forthright curiosity. Isaac and Grace exchanged startled glances, then laughed. "Would that be acceptable to you, Timothy?" Isaac asked seriously. The boy considered this with equal gravity. "Does that mean we get to stay at the ranch forever?" "All of us." "That's the plan," Grace confirmed. "If the magistrate approves and the society agrees." Timothy's face split into a wide grin. "Then I reckon that'd be just fine," he declared, in an uncanny imitation of Isaac's drawl. News of their engagement spread through Copper Springs like wildfire. The town that had initially been skeptical of Grace and her orphans now rallied behind them. The minister offered to officiate at a Christmas Eve ceremony, and women appeared at the schoolhouse with offers of fabric for a wedding dress and decorations for the church. Isaac rode to Tucson himself to speak with the Orphan Welfare Society, presenting their case with unexpected eloquence. He returned 3 days later with written permission for Grace to retain guardianship of all 5 children, pending their legal adoption following the marriage. They were surprisingly amenable, he told Grace as they walked along the creek behind his cabin, their cabin soon. Apparently, finding homes for 5 children, especially the older ones, has been nearly impossible. And when I mentioned that the ranch could eventually be their inheritance, he shrugged. That sealed it. Grace squeezed his hand. "And you're certain about this? Taking on all 5 at once?" Isaac stopped, turning to face her. "I'm certain about you," he said simply. "The children are part of who you are now. And truthfully, I can't imagine the ranch without them anymore." Timothy checking the herd, Emma gathering herbs, James fixing every loose board he can find. "They've worked their way into your heart," Grace observed with a smile. "As have you." He pulled her close, still marveling that he was permitted such intimacy. "I spent years believing that caring for others was a weakness I couldn't afford. You've shown me it's actually my greatest strength." The kiss they shared then was a promise, of family, of home, of a future built together despite the harsh realities of frontier life. Christmas Eve, 1885. The small church in Copper Springs overflowed with townsfolk and ranchers from miles around, all gathered to witness the union of Isaac Young and Grace Nolan. Candles illuminated the simple space, their light multiplied by cedar boughs and holly berries brought from the mountains by well-wishers. Isaac stood at the altar, wearing his best suit and a nervous expression. Beside him, Timothy beamed with importance in his role as best man, proudly holding the simple gold band Isaac had purchased in Tucson. A murmur went through the congregation as the church door opened. Isaac's breath caught as Grace appeared in the doorway, more beautiful than he had ever seen her. Her dress, sewn by the women of the town, was ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, simple but elegant, like Grace herself. Her honey blonde hair was arranged in soft curls beneath a veil of delicate lace, and she carried a bouquet of winter greenery and dried flowers from their garden. Emma, Sarah, and Daniel preceded her down the aisle, the girls scattering pine needles that filled the church with their fresh scent. James walked beside Grace, solemnly performing the duty of giving the bride away. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices steady with conviction despite the emotion of the moment. When Reverend Blackwell pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up shook the rafters of the small church. The celebration continued at the town hall, transformed with greenery and ribbon into a festive space. There was music from local fiddle players, dancing, and a feast to which every household had contributed something. Late in the evening, as the festivities continued around them, Isaac drew Grace outside into the crisp December night. Above them, stars spangled the velvet sky, and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "A wedding gift." He placed a small package wrapped in brown paper in her hands. Grace unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-carved wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft fabric, lay a delicate gold locket. "Oh, Isaac," she breathed, lifting it to examine the intricate engraving on its surface, a desert landscape with mountains in the distance, remarkably similar to the view from their ranch. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a tiny painting of their cabin with 6 figures standing before it. Isaac, Grace, and the 5 children, their faces rendered with surprising detail despite the miniature size. How did you? Jim Winters' wife was an artist back east, Isaac explained. She worked from the photograph we took last month. Do you like it? Grace's eyes filled with tears. It's perfect, she whispered. Our family. Isaac fastened the locket around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. I wanted you to always have us with you, even when we're apart. I don't intend for us to be apart very often, Mr. Young, Grace said, her smile mischievous despite her tears. Is that so, Mrs. Young? He pulled her close, still marveling at the right to do so. Indeed. We have a ranch to build, 5 children to raise, and a lifetime to spend together. I don't intend to waste a moment of it. Their kiss beneath the winter stars sealed that promise, a vow as binding as those they had exchanged before God and community. The journey ahead would not be easy. The frontier remained a harsh and unforgiving place. But they would face its challenges together, drawing strength from the love that had transformed a solitary ranch into a true home. Spring, 1886. The Young ranch buzzed with activity as final preparations were made for the barn raising. What had once been a modest operation had expanded considerably in the months since Isaac and Grace's Christmas Eve wedding. The garden had tripled in size, with neat rows of vegetables stretching toward the creek. A new chicken coop housed 36 laying hens, and the corral contained not only Isaac's original stock, but 4 gentle ponies for the children. The cattle herd had increased by a third, thanks to a successful spring calving season and a partnership with a neighboring rancher. Most significant, however, was the new building taking shape behind the original cabin. A proper 2-story home with enough bedrooms for their growing family and space for the school. Grace now operated 3 days a week for both their children and those from nearby homesteads. Are you certain the beams are secure? Grace called to Isaac, who was checking the framework with several other men from town. For the 10th time, yes, he replied with fond exasperation. The engineer from Tucson approved the plans himself. Grace nodded, though she couldn't help worrying. The barn raising represented the final phase of their spring expansion, a structure large enough to house not only livestock, but the equipment needed for the agricultural experiments Isaac had begun. Miss Grace, Daniel, now 5, tugged at her skirt. Can I help serve the lemonade? She smiled down at their youngest, whose shyness had given way to eager helpfulness in recent months. Of course you may. The jugs are ready in the summer kitchen. All around them, the community that had once barely tolerated their presence now pitched in with wholehearted support. The success of the Young ranch had become a point of pride for Copper Springs, proof that even in the harsh Arizona territory, determination and cooperation could yield prosperity. As the men raised the massive center beam of the new barn, Grace found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. Less than a year ago, she had arrived in Copper Springs with 5 traumatized orphans and little hope for their future. Now they stood on land that was legally theirs, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, building a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Isaac caught her eye across the busy yard and smiled, that rare, transformative smile that still made her heart flutter. In that moment, Grace was struck by the realization that the desolate frontier she had once viewed with trepidation had become home in every sense of the word. That evening, after the community dinner that followed the successful barn raising, Isaac and Grace sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow they would move into the new house. But tonight they savored this final evening in the simple structure where their journey had begun. Do you remember telling me that Arizona demands we earn its beauty by enduring its challenges? Isaac asked, his arm around her shoulders. Grace nodded, leaning into his embrace. I think we've earned our share. And then some. He kissed the top of her head. But I wouldn't trade a moment of it. Nor would Grace. The path had not been easy. There had been setbacks and struggles, moments of doubt and despair. But each challenge had only strengthened the bonds between them, forging a family from the broken pieces of their separate lives. As darkness fell over the Young ranch, the first stars appeared overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning. But now, instead of symbolizing lonely isolation, they represented the infinite possibilities of the future they were building together. A dream ranch for orphaned children had become something more, a home where love had conquered frontier hardship and where the true treasure lay not in the land itself, but in the family that tended it. I love you, Isaac Young. Grace whispered, turning in his arms to meet his gaze. And I love you, Grace Young. He replied, his voice rough with emotion. More than I ever thought possible. Their kiss, tender and unhurried, held the promise of all the years to come. Years filled with growth, challenges, and the enduring love that had transformed a solitary cowboy and a determined young teacher into the heart of a thriving frontier family.